My name is Bridget, I'm 35, and I just realized that a decade of building a man's empire can be erased by a single whisper from a 23-year-old girl in a pleated skirt. We were in our Chicago penthouse, the city lights shimmering behind the floor-to-ceiling glass, but the atmosphere inside was suffocating. My husband Phillip was hosting a high-stakes board meeting, and his sweet new assistant Valerie was standing way too close to him. Suddenly, she turned to me in front of everyone, the city's top investors, and said with a trembling, fake innocent voice, "Bridget, please stop controlling him. He's drowning under your thumb and it's hurting the firm." I felt the air leave the room. I looked at Phillip, expecting him to shut her down, but he just sighed, rubbed his temples, and looked at me with genuine resentment. "She's right, Bridget. You're exhausting me. Just go to the kitchen." I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply laughed, a cold, sharp sound that silenced the room. I walked to the mahogany table and dropped a heavy stack of documents right in front of them. "Am I overthinking, Phillip? Or are you just guilty?" As I spoke, a glossy photo slipped from the pile and slid across the polished wood. Phillip's face went from pale to ghostly white as he lunged to grab it, but he was too late. Everyone saw it. The sweet assistant's smirk vanished instantly. If you want to see how a controlling wife dismantles a betrayal piece by piece, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't believe what was in that photo, trust me. The fallout is just beginning. 2 nights before that chaotic meeting in our penthouse, the Chicago skyline was nothing but a backdrop for Phillip's corporate vanity at the annual charity gala. I spent weeks refining his keynote speech, ensuring every word projected the image of a visionary leader, yet I was relegated to the corner of the ballroom like an expensive piece of furniture. Phillip stood at the center of a circle of tech moguls, his hand resting casually on the small of Valerie's back while she giggled at every mediocre joke he made. She was wearing a dress that cost more than her monthly salary, a gift from the firm, according to Phillip. And she looked at me with a triumphant glint in her eyes that no one else seemed to notice. The tension snapped during the main course when the waiters brought out the seared scallops with a signature walnut-crusted garnish. I had personally reviewed the guest restrictions weeks in advance, knowing exactly who could eat what, but as soon as Valerie took a single bite, she began gasping for air. Her face flushed a dramatic shade of red, and she clutched Phillip's arm, whimpering about a nut allergy that had never been mentioned in her medical file. "Bridget, how could you?" Phillip roared, his voice echoing across the silent ballroom as he shoved his chair back so hard it nearly toppled. He didn't check the kitchen order or ask the waiter. He turned his fury directly on me, in front of the city's most influential CEOs. "You handled the catering, Bridget. You knew she was sensitive," he hissed, his eyes burning with a mixture of embarrassment and accusations. I stood my ground, my voice steady despite the sea of judging eyes surrounding us, and calmly reminded him that I had double-checked every ingredient. But it didn't matter. Phillip snatched a napkin, wiped a fake tear from Valerie's cheek, and guided her toward the exit, leaving me standing alone at a table for 12. The whispers started before they even reached the door, branding me as the jealous, bitter wife who tried to sabotage a poor, innocent assistant. I watched them walk away, realizing then that my husband wasn't just being manipulated, he was actively choosing to be the villain in our marriage. The morning sun reflected off the pristine white tablecloths at the Lakeside Country Club, but the warmth didn't reach the woman sitting across from me. Gloria, my mother-in-law, stirred her Earl Grey with a slow, deliberate motion that signaled an impending lecture. She didn't ask how I was sleeping, or if I needed anything after the public humiliation at the gala. She simply placed a gold-trimmed invitation on the table and looked at me with eyes as cold as flint. Phillip had obviously called her first, spinning a tale of a jealous wife whose unstable behavior was threatening the very foundation of his career. "Valerie, we have spent 40 years building the prestige of the Phillip family name in this city," she began, her voice a low, dangerous purr that brooked no interruption. She leaned in closer, the scent of expensive perfume and old money clinging to her like armor. Gloria made it clear that my role was to be the invisible pillar of support, not a source of scandal that could jeopardize Phillip's upcoming promotion to senior partner. According to her, Valerie was nothing more than a temporary distraction that I was blowing out of proportion with my controlling tendencies. She demanded that I host a private brunch at our penthouse and personally apologize to that girl to smooth things over before the investors' retreat. A woman of your stature should know how to manage her husband's minor indiscretions without making a scene, Bridget, she hissed, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. The sheer audacity of her request felt like a physical blow, yet I kept my expression a mask of calm indifference. I realized then that to Gloria, I wasn't a daughter-in-law or even a human being. I was a strategic asset that was suddenly malfunctioning. She didn't care about the truth of the accident or the blatant disrespect Phillip was showing me in public. All that mattered was the polished exterior of the family brand, and she was willing to crush me to keep it shiny. I looked at the gold-trimmed invitation, then back at her sharp, calculating face, and I felt something inside me finally snap. I wouldn't be hosting any brunches, and I certainly wouldn't be apologizing to a shark in a pleated skirt. I stood up, left my tea untouched, and walked out of that club, already dialing Terrence's private number. A week after my freezing encounter with Gloria at the country club, the entire firm gathered for the annual corporate retreat on a sprawling luxury yacht docked at Navy Pier. The Chicago skyline stood tall and indifferent in the distance, a jagged silhouette of glass and steel that mirrored the coldness in my chest. Phillip had spent the morning avoiding me, choosing instead to stand at the bow of the boat with Mallory, pointing out landmarks as if she were a clueless tourist and he her personal savior. I watched from the upper deck, my ankle still throbbing from a minor trip earlier that morning, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing my pain. The wind was picking up, turning the blue waters of Lake Michigan into a choppy, unpredictable mess of whitecaps that rattled the heavy vessel. The atmosphere shifted from celebratory to chaotic when a sudden, violent swell slammed into the side of the yacht, catching everyone off guard. Mallory, who had been leaning precariously against the railing to take a photo, let out a piercing shriek that cut through the roar of the engines. She didn't just slip, she practically launched herself into the frigid water with a theatrical flair that screamed for an audience. I was standing less than 5 feet away, and the force of the jolt sent me crashing against the jagged edge of a heavy bronze cleat, slicing a deep gash into my forearm. Blood began to soak through the sleeve of my white linen blazer, and the world spun for a sickening second as the cold metal bit into my skin. "Phillip! Help!" I gasped, my voice barely audible over the wind, my hand clutching the railing to keep from falling overboard myself. Phillip's head snapped toward me for a fleeting second, his eyes landing on the crimson stain spreading across my arm, but then he heard Mallory's muffled splash. Without a single word of concern for me, without even checking if I could stand, he tore off his designer jacket and dove headfirst into the lake. I watched with a hollow heart as he pulled a laughing, shivering Mallory toward the rescue ladder, cradling her head against his chest as if she were the only thing in the world that mattered. As they were pulled back onto the deck, Mallory caught my gaze over Phillip's shoulder and gave me a slow, chilling wink while pretending to sob. At that moment, the last shred of my loyalty to Phillip sank to the bottom of the lake, replaced by a resolve as hard as the Chicago ice. 2 days after the yacht incident, the mahogany-paneled walls of Terrence's private office felt like the only sanctuary left in a city that had turned its back on me. Terrence, a shark of a lawyer with a penchant for high-stakes litigation, didn't offer me pity. He offered a thick, manila folder that contained the jagged pieces of a puzzle I hadn't even realized I was solving. We sat in silence for a moment as the rain lashed against the windows of his skyscraper suite, the gray Chicago sky matching the cold determination in my veins. Phillip was still at the penthouse, probably playing nursemaid to a perfectly healthy Mallory, while I was here, finally seeing the strings that had been pulling our lives apart. "Bridget, you were right to trust your gut, but the truth is far uglier than a simple office affair," Terrence muttered, sliding a series of financial records across the desk. The documents revealed a systematic siphoning of funds from Phillip's consulting firm, redirected through a shell company registered in Delaware, a company that Mallory had quietly established just weeks after her hiring. But the real shock came when Terrence flipped to a background check that Phillip had clearly skipped in his rush to be the hero. Mallory wasn't just a lucky graduate, she was the estranged daughter of Marcus Vance, the man Phillip had ruthlessly bankrupted a decade ago to build his own reputation. She hadn't stumbled into our lives by accident. She had been meticulously crafted to be the perfect weapon of destruction, using her sweet incompetence to mask a corporate espionage plot. Phillip was so blinded by his own ego that he hadn't noticed his sweet muse was actually a Trojan horse sent to dismantle his empire from the inside out. I stared at a grainy photo of Mallory meeting with one of Philip's biggest competitors in a secluded diner on the outskirts of the city, her fake innocent smile replaced by a look of cold, calculating greed. Terrence leaned back, his eyes sharp and expectant. "We have enough for a devastating divorce, Bridget, but if we play this right, we can take back every intellectual property right you ever signed over to him," he whispered. I didn't need time to think. The memory of the blood on my white blazer and the laughter on the yacht was all the motivation I required. I stood up, gripped the folder tightly, and told Terrence to prepare the final documents for the upcoming anniversary gala. Phillip thought he was winning, but he was merely dancing on a stage that I was about to set on fire. The grand ballroom of the Palmer House was a sea of black ties and silk gowns, the air thick with the scent of expensive champagne and the smug satisfaction of Philip's ego. It was the firm's 10-year anniversary gala, and my husband stood on the illuminated stage, holding a crystal trophy for a marketing strategy that I had stayed up until 4 a.m. to finish while he was working late with Mallory. He looked at the crowd, his arm around a radiant Mallory who was dressed in a shimmering silver gown that practically screamed future trophy wife, and thanked his dedicated team for their innovative spirit. I sat at the head table, my wounded arm hidden beneath a long-sleeved velvet dress, watching as Phillip leaned in to whisper something in Mallory's ear that made her giggle like a schoolgirl. The applause was deafening until I stood up, not to offer a toast, but to walk toward the podium with a calm, predatory grace that stopped the music mid-measure. Phillip's smile faltered, his grip on the trophy tightening as I reached for the microphone with a steady hand. "It's a beautiful award, Phillip, but let's be honest about whose name should actually be engraved on it," I began, my voice echoing with a clarity that silenced the room. I signaled to the tech booth, where Terrence was already waiting with a thumb drive containing the digital trail of Mallory's corporate espionage and the original time-stamped files of every project Phillip had claimed as his own. The massive screens behind us flickered to life, showing not a celebratory slideshow, but the bank transfers to Mallory's shell company and the photos of her clandestine meetings with our biggest competitors. Mallory's silver-clad shoulders slumped as she looked at the screens, the fake innocent mask finally shattering into a look of pure, unadulterated terror. The room erupted into a low, frantic buzz of whispers as the investors realized they had been pouring millions into a company that was being bled dry by a girl Phillip had brought into the inner circle. Phillip's face drained of all color, his eyes darting from me to the crowd of shocked faces, realizing that his controlling wife had just dismantled his entire public image in less than 60 seconds. I looked him dead in the eye, took the crystal trophy from his shaking hands, and placed it on the floor at his feet. "The firm doesn't belong to you anymore, Phillip. It belongs to the creditors you've been defrauding," I whispered, turning my back on his crumbling world without a single backward glance. The silence in our Chicago penthouse was more deafening than the roar of the gala crowd had been just hours earlier. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the gray mist roll over Lake Michigan, the very water that had almost claimed my dignity a week ago. Behind me, the sound of glass breaking echoed through the foyer as Phillip threw his briefcase against the wall in a fit of impotent rage. He looked like a ghost of the man I had married, his tuxedo disheveled, his eyes bloodshot, and his hands trembling with the weight of a ruined reputation. Mallory was gone, whisked away by building security before the police could arrive to question her about the stolen trade secrets, leaving Phillip to face the wreckage of his life alone. "You destroyed me, Bridget!" he screamed, his voice cracking as he stumbled toward me, smelling of desperation and cheap scotch. He tried to grab my shoulders, his fingers digging into the velvet of my dress, but I stepped back with a cold, rhythmic precision that made him stumble. Suddenly, the rage vanished, replaced by a pathetic, manipulative whimpering that I knew all too well. He fell to his knees, clutching at the hem of my skirt, sobbing about how Mallory had bewitched him and how we could start over if I just signed a public statement claiming the evidence was a misunderstanding. He actually thought that 10 years of my life could be bought back with a few salty tears and a promise to be better. I looked down at him, feeling nothing but a profound sense of exhaustion and a flick of pity for the hollow shell he had become. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a single, thick envelope, the final divorce decree, and a cease and desist order for every intellectual property right I owned. "I didn't destroy you, Philip. I simply stopped protecting you from yourself," I said, my voice as steady as the steel beams of the skyscraper we stood in. I dropped the papers onto his slumped shoulders, watching them scatter across the Italian marble floor like dead leaves. There would be no reconciliation, no second chances, and no more sweet assistance to blame. I walked past him toward the elevator, leaving the keys to the penthouse on the hallway table, finally breathing air that wasn't tainted by his lies. 3 months after the cold silence of the Chicago penthouse, the vibrant, chaotic energy of Manhattan's Upper West Side felt like the first breath of clean air I'd taken in a decade. I stood on the small balcony of my new brownstone, watching the sunset paint the Hudson River in shades of burnt orange and deep violet, holding a glass of wine that tasted like pure victory. My phone buzzed with a final update from Terrence, who had spent the last quarter meticulously dismantling Philip's professional existence. The fallout had been swift and brutal, just as I had intended when I walked away from that marble hallway. Philip had lost the firm, the penthouse, and every shred of his credibility. He was currently facing a series of federal lawsuits for corporate fraud and unpaid debts that would keep him in courtrooms for the next 5 years. Even Gloria's high society influence couldn't save her golden son this time, and the rumors in Chicago suggested she had retreated to an estate in Florida to avoid the social leprosy that now attached to the family name. As for Valerie, her sweet innocence hadn't held up under the scrutiny of the FBI. She was currently awaiting trial for the theft of trade secrets and wire fraud, her father's legacy of failure finally reaching its miserable conclusion. I looked at the news clipping Terrence had sent, a small, satisfying blurb about the bankruptcy of Phillip and Associates, and felt a strange, quiet sense of peace. I didn't hate them anymore. Hating them would have required an emotional investment that they no longer deserved from a woman of my caliber. I had recently launched Bridget Strategic, a boutique branding agency that was already attracting the very clients Philip had lost, but this time, my name was the only one on the door. I realized then that my greatest mistake hadn't been controlling Philip, but rather suppressing my own brilliance to keep his fragile ego from shattering under the weight of my success. The scars on my arm and the memories of the cold lake water had become my badges of honor, reminders that I was the architect of my own destiny. I set the phone down, turned my back on the ghosts of Chicago, and walked into my brightly lit living room, ready to write the next chapter of a life that belonged entirely to me.